parent. It could be a spouse, it could be a child, it could be a grandparent, or it could be a non-family member. But carers are very important. And I guess we put our heads together and thought about what are the things that we would love to be able to tell you given the time. And so I'll try and churn through these. Let's go. First one is a wise man knows how little he knows. And I think it's just a quick way of summing up the fact that the more you know about what persistent pain is, the better dialogue that you can have with your loved one about, I guess, what they're going through. There's a capacity for you to engage with them with language that resonates with them, and your actions can also reflect that too. Perhaps your loved one might not want you to necessarily come into the consult with them, but I love it when carers come in to consults with their loved ones. I think it's great because they can hear what I'm saying. And often, you know, people with persistent pain, they go to a consult and their GP does a lot of talking, and then they walk out of there and they go, I don't know what she said. She rabbited on quite a long time, and I've got the script in my hand and she wants me to see a psych. But if the loved one's in there with them, they can say, yeah, dear, she said, yeah, she did talk a lot, didn't she? But they can also then be there as a point of reference. So I encourage you, with your loved one's permission, to attend appointments. Go to the physio appointment, see what happens. And the other useful thing to do would be to try and understand the medications. I think there's a lot of stigma around opiates, but they do have a role and they're there for a reason. So it'd be useful to understand what side effects can come from opiates or from other pain medications. And it's not to say, you know, well, I don't think you should be taking this because I read the PI. The pharmacist gave me the PI, and you can get. Did you know you can get fulminant liver failure with this? There's been one case in the US. You shouldn't be taking this medication. It's not to swat up to be unhelpful, but it's to swat up to say, look, you know, I understand that when you take this medication, you get drowsy, or you get constipated, or, you know, you get a fuzzy head, and I know when you're on this medication, I can step up and be there for you during this time. So that's the point. And look, there are some really good sources of information. There's Chronic Pain Australia. All these little links are in your handout, but these are some reputable sources of information. I'd encourage you to stay away from blogs and kind of homemade websites because there's always bias in reporting, whereas these guys are largely unbiased. They're a good source of reference for further information. So if you can, please spot up. Move past the fix. I think we've gone through this in depth tonight, but the whole purpose is to try and move your thinking away from a fix to self-management, because that just allows you both to be moving forward at the same pace and in the same direction. And I think probably what some carers find hard is to work out, how much do I do? Because if I really want to be helpful, so if I do, I can sometimes do too much, and then they get annoyed because I'm being too helpful. And so, okay, so I step back, come on, you do it, and then they get, you know, a pain flare, and then I'm not being helpful enough, and there's this weird, awkward dance, right, between what you can do and what you can't. So I think that open, honest dialogue is really important. If a person's in pain, communicate it, and if you're not sure how helpful you can be, just ask. Encouragement is also really important, because if someone's taking steps to extend their capabilities, you know, trying something new, going to the psychologist, trying a new exercise regime, or even if they did something that they couldn't do the other day, encouragement is always really important. I know that sounds obvious, but when you're living with persistent pain, it's that noise in your head about how useless you are or how much of a burden you are gets really loud, and so we rely on our loved ones to remind us otherwise. And I guess the last point on this is, don't expect outcomes to be constant. Just because someone made it to the letterbox one day doesn't mean they can do it tomorrow. It doesn't mean they're not trying, it just means that their pain will vary. But as long as your support is unconditional, then the effort will be unconditional too. Reconnect daily. I like this one. I reckon everybody should do this, really. I think Harry was talking earlier about the fact that people with persistent pain tend to lose connection with the things that they used to be able to do. They start here, and then over time they end up back here. And I think our carers are a useful tether or anchor to the lives that probably people would like to identify with a bit more. They introduce a bit of normalcy, or maybe not, depends on who you're married to. But you're keeping them in touch with the things that you found special about them to start with. You can remind them about the things that they still are capable of. And it also maintains that connectedness in your relationship, which is a good anchoring point as well. So find the joy. I think just the reason why we don't is because we get stuck. It's like when we're hungry, we get home, we just look in the fridge and go, that'll do. You know, it's the same when you go to connect with your partner. If you don't give it much thought, you just keep reaching for the beans, you know. So I challenge you to come up with new and interesting ways of maintaining that connection and finding the joy, even if it's small. It doesn't have to be big. Read the play. I think carers tend to do this well, but I think it goes without saying that a person with persistent pain can sometimes just get tired of talking about their pain, tired of articulating, tired of communicating. They might just have to stump up. It's my partner's mate's 50th birthday. I just got to stump up and go. So if their loved one asks them, how are you going? Are you going to be all right? They go, yeah, I'm going to be good, you know. I think looking for non-verbal signs is really important, because if you notice they're not doing well, and it's not an exhaustive list, but I think we can all pick up on the signs of when someone's not quite right, not walking quite as confidently, they're irritable. There's a whole long list, but looking for the non-verbal signs I would encourage you to look for, because it allows you to make different decisions about how you relate to them during that time. If you just take them on face value, look, they said they were fine, and now they're fighting my head off every time I ask. Well, it's because you're not reading the play. And look, to be honest with you, it's one of those things that you're not always going to have the energy to do. As a carer, you're always going to try and be sensitive to their needs. You're always going to try and anticipate and find that balance between doing too much and not doing enough. So I realise this takes energy, absolutely, but it is definitely appreciated, because there are going to be times that with persistent pain just will stump up and just not have the energy to communicate their needs. Depersonalise. I think it's the point I'm trying to make here is that it might not always be about you. If your loved one is not having a good day and having a bit of a go, or snapping or being moody or irritable, this is where reading the play is so important, because if you notice that they are having a high pain day, and you realise that they're being overtly negative or difficult to be around, it's sometimes useful just to not to take their words on face value, but to be able to say, you know what, okay, I can see they're having a hard time. I'm just going to take just a half a step back, and then you can reassess what you need to do. Because it's very easy to take it personally when it's just you and your loved one and you're battling this, I guess this dog from do you remember from the video right at the start? And it's just you three. Sometimes it can become a little bit, what would you say, to and fro. Someone with pain fires up, and then the person reacts, and then it kind of escalates into an argument that perhaps didn't need to happen. So if you have the ability to be able to read the play, take half a step back and go, you know what, look, it's not about that. I can just see that you're in pain. You just need a moment. What can I do? You know, and that's a great way of de-escalating a situation that might not need to blow up. What Ari was saying earlier about mental health being quite a common condition with persistent pain, I would say it's almost ubiquitous. It's just a matter of degrees. And it has nothing to do with your stoicism or your personality. It just has everything to do with the fact that pain will just wear you out. It eventually wears you out. So I think that there is a really great support group for carers of people who have persistent pain and a comorbid mental health disorder. And so they're a support group that you can contact at any time for further, I guess, TLC. So, you've read the play, you've taken a step back, and you haven't taken personally your loved one's behaviour, yet you recognise that they're suffering and that they're in need of some assistance, either physical or emotional. So you'd like to lend a hand. And often I find this is sometimes the hardest part in recognising how can I be helpful, how best can I nurture my loved one at this time. Most of us love to just jump in and provide a solution, and that's rather satisfying. It's a nice little neat bow on a package, but unfortunately it's not really what our loved ones need. Often it's very difficult to articulate your situation, to articulate the complex emotional state that's brewing because of your persistent pain, the frustration, the shame, the loneliness, the exhaustion. Sometimes these words don't come easily, as we touched on earlier. And so your loved one really needs a safe space to unpack those feelings and to be listened to. And that's a concept that I like to refer to as holding space. It's deceptively difficult. I'll give you the big tip. It's difficult to provide your entire attention for the sole purpose of listening and not fixing. And I can promise you, however, it will be the most well-received thing that you can do. When we listen, I think there's this desire also to jump in and provide, I guess, sympathy. To be able to acknowledge that, yes, I hear what you're saying, and I've been there, and I know what you're going through, or I can relate. I had a similar experience myself, for example. But there is a great deal of difference between sympathy and empathy. And I would encourage you to have a look at this really brilliant video by Brené Brown, which just neatly sums up the difference between the two. It's a 3-minute animated video, which I think will resonate with a lot of you and provide additional tools for allowing you to be the listener that your loved ones need. One of the most important points, however, is to recognise that this giving of self, your attention, your time, your empathy, your physical support, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And as a carer, you're really remiss to acknowledge any of that, because you don't want to appear like your loved one is a burden, and they're not. But we all have to recognise that a carer's giving is a jug that needs refilling, like anybody else's. And it's really important to check your own energy and patience, particularly when you find yourself feeling a bit brittle, a bit snappy. It's usually a sign that you need to check in and nurture yourself as a carer too. Listening to my patients, I think this is one of the areas that they find most difficult to do. They're so good at giving, it comes so naturally. They get this vicarious sense of joy through providing support to their loved one. But as soon as they consider stepping away and doing something for themselves, they're filled with this sense of guilt. It's like, I'm not sure whether it's because they are capable of doing the things that their loved one can't and they feel guilty about that, or they feel guilty about leaving their loved one in the event that their loved one needs them and they're not there. I think they're all very reasonable concepts. But the time that you spend away from your loved one nurturing yourself is a good investment in the relationship, because you can't pour from an empty pot. And I guess that's something that a loved one with persistent pain would be the first to vocalise as well. They're not stupid. They know, they can see their loved ones getting worn down, and that makes them feel even worse. They feel like even more of a burden. So please keep in mind that your physical health needs regular checks with your GP. Your mental health needs regular topping up with little bursts of enjoyable activity peppered throughout your week. And also your sociability needs to be nurtured as well. I think socialising becomes a little tricky for people with persistent pain because certain venues don't provide adequate seating, or the event runs long, or they're just mentally tired. Aside from the physical tiredness, they're mentally tired. And so often carers will down-regulate their social activity to accommodate their loved ones. But I don't see any shame or problem with a carer having nights out on their own or with their friends if their loved one with persistent pain is not up for it. I think that's a dialogue that I would encourage all carers and loved ones to have to ensure that everybody's needs are met. Because it is okay not to be okay. There are dedicated organisations in Australia set up to assist carers and support them both physically and mentally with this full-time job. And I would strongly encourage you to reach out for support if you feel that you're not in a good place, or preferably before you enter that not such good place, before you feel overwhelmed. There is absolutely no shame in reaching out and asking for some support. And I'll leave you with this little slide, which I quite like. Whereas by helping one person might not change the whole world, but it could change the world for just one person. And I think that sums up beautifully the role of the carer. Places to start in reaching out for support. I'll leave this slide with you to have a little look through and record those numbers down. You've got both physical, financial and emotional support there through those various organisations. Please keep RUBIX Health in mind. Persistent pain program is available both in a group setting and as an individual pathway to assist your loved ones in developing a different relationship with their pain, and also to provide support to carers as well. And thank you for your time and for listening to our presentation.